All right, today I'll be talking about mental illness in high school. Let's dive in. Hey, what's up, you guys? For those of you who don't know me, my name's Lillian Jacobson. I'm a English education major at the University of Georgia. And before I get started with my podcast today, I just want to stress what is currently on the screen right now. It is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. It's a 24-hour call center. So if you are ever having suicidal thoughts or suicidal actions and you just need someone to talk to, please call the number on screen. And also below it is a website with the top 25 other resources that you can call. And those resources include numbers for things like domestic abuse and also depression and anxiety. So without further ado, let's get started. So as you heard in the little intro, I will be talking about mental illness in high school. I'm going to start off by talking about the facts and statistics of mental illness in youth and specifically high school age kids. 1 in 5 kids have an emotional, mental, or behavioral disorder. That's 20% of kids, which is a pretty high number if you ask me. Of those kids with a disorder, 1 in 10 have a mental health issue that impairs their function at home, school, or in their community. What this means is that their disorder or their mental health issue is so bad that it prevents them from doing something they want to do at home, at school, or in the community. So a kid's anxiety might prevent them from being on the debate team, or a kid's depression may be so severe that they never want to leave home and can't participate in the community. That's kind of scary to me. That's just insane. That's a lot of kids who are like that. People are estimating between 50% and 80% do not receive the mental health care they need. That's a lot of people with disorders who aren't getting the care they need. It's just, I keep saying this, it's a crazy number. It's crazy high. There are so many kids who aren't getting that help, who really need that help. It's just completely insane to me. And those numbers may seem arbitrary. Yes, that's a lot of kids who have mental health and who aren't getting help, but oh, who cares? They're not being really affected by it. It's just something they have to deal with. That's wrong. 40% of the kids who have a mental, emotional, or behavioral disorder drop out of high school. This is the highest dropout rate of any disability group. That statistic, that fact, honestly caught me off guard. I would have never thought that half of the kids with a mental illness or an emotional or behavioral disorder would drop out. That is just a crazy number to me. I almost can't believe it. It's just kind of insane, I'm not going to lie. So there are so many different mental illnesses a kid could have. A lot of the big ones that we see a lot of are depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, bulimia, anorexia, stuff like that. All these mental health issues are very serious. No one is more extreme or severe than the next. Anyone with a mental health issue should not compare themselves to someone else with a mental health issue. it's different. Everyone's different. Other emotional, behavioral, and mental disorders are things like dyslexia, auditory processing disorder, ADHD, ADD. Someone could fall on the autism spectrum. This would also include things like Down syndrome, schizophrenia, emotional disturbance disorders, PTSD, just things of that nature. So there's a lot of them, and it's kind of hard to have an overarching kind of general plan that fits every single student and every single mental illness. There are, however, 2 different plans in place in high schools. Those plans are the IEP, which stands for Individualized Education Plan, and the 405 plan. A lot of people get these plans confused. They don't know the difference, or they don't know what either of these plans are at all. So I'm here to explain. The IEP is a plan or program that is developed to ensure a child receives specialized instruction and related services. The 504 plan is developed to ensure a child with disability is identified under the law and receives accommodations that will ensure academic success and access to the learning environment. These plans, a lot of people get them confused. Honestly, they sound very similar. It's kind of hard to know the difference because they are both for kids with an emotional, mental, or behavioral disorder. So basically, the difference that you need to know is the IEP is very individualized and it focuses on the child holistically. So an IEP might also include different things for a child's extracurricular activities versus a 405 is more of a general kind of plan that many kids can have the same 405 plan. So that one is more broad and many kids can have it versus an IEP is very individualized. For both plans, you go in, you meet with a counselor, you meet with teachers, you meet with the special education people at the school. It's a parent-teacher conference, really. The child is there. You talk about what your disability is, what sort of things you may need, and just how the school can best help the child. Honestly, these plans are great. They help so many kids across the country. In my school, I know the special education programs with kids who had IEPs and 504 plans. It was great. They had study time that was carved out of each day for the kids with those plans. They had specialized teachers in every single classroom that a kid with one of the plans was in. I thought my high school did a wonderful job with these plans. However, I do know some high schools may be underfunded, may not have access to some of the things that my high school was fortunate to have access to. So these plans can kind of falter and may not be the best at every single school. This being said, I think IEPs and 504s are great. They help so many kids. It's just honestly top notch. However, IEPs and 405 plans are more catered to those with learning disabilities. So kids with dyslexia, ADHD, kids who may fall on the autism spectrum, kids with Down syndrome, they're more of the kids that the IEP and the 504 plan is geared to. Or at least that's what I've seen in my experience, and that's what kind of the overarching information is really geared toward. There are still so many other kids with mental illness and mental disability or emotional disorders or behavioral disorders that aren't getting the help they need from these plans. Specifically, kids with anxiety and depression who may have episodes and aren't getting the help and the care and the attention from schools and teachers they need to get through that and also to stay on top of their academic work. There's not really a good plan that kids like that fit in. So, the IEP is more geared to individualized programs, which means that someone with anxiety or depression could have an IEP. However, a big part of why kids aren't getting the help they need or aren't asking for it or aren't even being diagnosed when they need to be is because there are so many different stigmas and there are so many different stereotypes and just different issues revolving around the topic of mental illness. One of these is the stigma around being diagnosed with a mental illness. Right off the bat, I want to say that these prejudices, these stereotypes, are just untrue. I honestly couldn't tell you why they exist, but it is not the case for everyone with a mental illness and is not the rule. There are exceptions to it, but it's not the rule. So, a really big stereotype around mental illness is that people with mental illnesses are crazy. They're just insane. They'll snap at any second and just fly off the handlebars at any moment, and you can't predict them, and they're just crazy. That's just not the case. There's just this whole stigma around mental illness, and in high school, there's just such this pressure to be cool and to fit in, and kids may be afraid to be diagnosed because they don't want to be seen as crazy. They don't want to be seen as the kid with depression or the kid with bipolar disorder or the kid with anxiety. So that may prevent a student from wanting to get help. Just the stigma and the stereotypes around it, which is crazy to me because they're not true. There's also stigmas and stereotypes and prejudices around the IEPs and 405 plans. Now, a lot of people see those special education programs as programs for people just on the autism spectrum or just with Down syndrome. That's also untrue. IEPs cater to so many different types of emotional, mental, and behavioral disorders that you could have dyslexia and have an IEP, or you could have ADHD and have an IEP. You could have Down syndrome and have an IEP, but that's not always the case. But there's this huge idea that just kids with Down syndrome and autism have those sort of plans and programs in their life. That also is another reason why kids may not want to have an IEP or a 504 plan, because they don't want to be labeled as someone with autism or someone with Down syndrome. Neither of those disabilities are wrong, by the way. Someone who's on the autism spectrum or someone with Down syndrome could be the happiest, well-functioning person and just be fine. But typically, people tend to view those sorts of people with those disorders as someone you pity, or someone weak, or someone who always needs help. I'm going to say this so many times, that's wrong. That stereotype is wrong. There doesn't need to be a set label for you, if that makes sense. Like, you don't need to be labeled as this one thing because you need an IEP or a 504. There's also a difference in generation and their views on mental illness. The generation of parents who have kids in high school right now may not view mental illness the same as the generation who are in high school. For a lot of parents and the older generation, mental health may not be as serious of a concern. They might not be prioritizing that, or they might not understand the severity of it. They might see a mental illness as an event versus a pattern. So something that happens once or twice, but not something that a kid is constantly struggling with. There's also the fear of misdiagnosis and overprescribing when a child is going to a psychiatrist and trying to get the help they need. I can completely understand this concern that some parents may have for their kids. It is already a relatively difficult thing to struggle with mental illness, and to be misdiagnosed is just a whole other thing that I couldn't even begin to know what it feels like to be misdiagnosed. But then also the fear of overprescribing. This is a genuine fear because many of the drugs that are being prescribed to help treat mental illness are also inappropriately used as recreational drugs. It's illegal, one, and two, it's very, very dangerous. It's very easy to get addicted to some of the drugs and can result in very serious things like death. For example, Xanax is often prescribed for anxiety and anxiety attacks. However, Xanax is also used illegally as a party drug and for recreational use, and is a prescription drug, and it's very dangerous. And there are many cases of kids overdosing on it. So the concern for a kid getting medication when they might not need it is very real and very understandable. However, this sometimes prevents parents from getting their child the help they need because they're so scared. They don't even want to go talk to a psychiatrist because they are so afraid that the doctor is going to immediately write a prescription or misdiagnose their child. Kids today also greatly struggle with pressures from society and from academics. These pressures might not necessarily lead to a mental illness, but there's a very real possibility that they can. For example, there's this huge push to have the perfect body and look as beautiful as all the girls on the magazine, and a lot of the time, a young woman is very impressionable and can become obsessed with this idea of looking perfect. Stuff like that can lead to mental illness like anorexia and bulimia and body dysmorphia, which basically means what a kid is seeing is morphed and is not actually what their body is like, which can be very dangerous because a kid may see themselves as too big when in reality they could be very small and struggling with anorexia. So there are all these pressures on students. There's all these different stereotypes around mental illness. There are all these concerns about getting help and just the different views between generations. And basically, it boils down to a lack of information. As I said before, it's estimated that 50 to 80% of kids with a mental, emotional, or behavioral disorder are not getting the help they need, which I think is credited to not knowing what to do or not knowing how to get help. For me personally, I started suffering with depression when I got into high school. I kind of brushed it off and it kept happening. So throughout my 9th and 10th grade years, I was having depressive episodes and I had a huge lack of motivation. It was just a very bad and dark time in my life. However, the episodes started getting fewer and far in between, and I kind of just brushed it off. I was like, well, it's not happening as often, so I guess it's gone. Or maybe I never even had depression in the first place. I never sought out help. Because one, I didn't even know how to get help. I didn't know how to ask for it. And two, I was honestly kind of afraid to. So, I'm in high school. I think everything is great. Then in 11th grade, I had my first anxiety attack. For me, anxiety presents in a way that is debilitating. When I start to have an anxiety attack, I can't stop it, pretty much. My hands start to sweat, my body starts to shake, my chest tightens, and then I can't breathe. It's a very scary experience, and when I had one for the first time in 11th grade, I absolutely freaked out. I had no idea what to do, who to talk to. I was just so in the dark. I was so lost. So I didn't reach out. I didn't get help. I didn't tell my parents. And for the rest of high school, it would happen, and I kind of just kept them hidden. I really was ashamed of them, to be honest. Then I got to college, and more people, more and more of my family, my friends, were getting the help they needed. I know quite a few people who suffer from mental illness, but who are getting help and are doing what they need to do to deal with it. I know it's never going to go away from them, for them, and it's always going to be something that you struggle with, but they're getting the help. And that's what kind of inspired me to say, I don't have to have an anxiety attack once a week, sometimes every day. I don't need to feel anxious almost every second I step out of my house. I can deal with this in a more healthy way. So basically, what I've kind of discovered is that all the issues really boil down to the lack of information students are getting. This is nobody's fault, really. It's just something that our society hasn't really thought to do, honestly. I don't think anyone is intentionally keeping information from students or not having conversations about mental illness for whatever reason. I just think that culturally, it hasn't been something that we've talked about, and so we just don't. I think this needs to change. So, what can schools do to change? There are so many things, I think. Starting with something as simple as having an assembly once a year or even once a semester, and just bringing in a psychiatrist or a therapist or a psychologist and just talking about mental health in a very general way. Talking about different symptoms, talking about different disorders, talking about different ways to reach out, different hotlines or websites, or even giving a psychiatrist's office number or a therapist's office number, so students have those different options and have the information, so if they need it, they already have it. They don't need to go to someone. They can do it very kind of on their own, kind of take the responsibility into their own hands and just get what they need. I think schools can take mental health more seriously in general also by having mental health days count as excused absences, or putting posters up with the suicide prevention hotline and different resources that students can go to, by having quiet study rooms students can go to if they need to focus, to get away from the stressors, to calm down if an anxiety attack happens, to just kind of have a space where it's very calming and very focused on good mental health. So schools can do a lot, and school systems can implement a lot of different programs and things to make the information known to their students. Teachers can also be a huge part of making mental illness known and just honestly being a person students can go talk to. Not even about mental health, just about any stressors, anything that makes them anxious, anything really going on in their lives, just being a person kids can talk to without crossing any lines. I'm not saying make the students tell all their darkest secrets or anything like that. I'm just saying that teachers can be just a support system in students' lives. I know my best and favorite teachers were like that in middle school. My favorite teachers would notice when something was wrong. They would pull me aside and say, "Hey, Lily, you seem kind of off today. Is there anything you want to talk about? Do you want to step out of class for a little bit?" Just noticing when I was off or when something was different was just so great. And my teachers in high school, the teachers who maybe opened their classrooms up during lunch so I could talk about different tests and stresses in my life, and then teachers who would just have chill days when they noticed a lot was going on academically in students' lives. Just putting mental health higher up on the priority list is something teachers could so easily do, and it would help students so much, even the kids who aren't necessarily suffering with mental illness. Just keeping good mental health should be a higher priority for teachers and for the school. So basically, the big thing today and in this podcast is a presentation of information. Just making sure kids know they have options, making sure kids know they're not alone, making sure students know that they're not weak or crazy or uncool if they have a mental illness and need help. Just being there. I mean, just giving them options so they don't go through high school feeling terrible about themselves, feeling trapped or anxious or depressed every single day they walk into the school. Because stuff like that affects them. It affects students in so many ways and can impact them later in life. It can have so many effects on who they become and what they do. It's just something that needs to be addressed more and talked about more. So with that, I hope you enjoyed my podcast. I hope I gave you some food for thought, and you're looking at different resources that if you're struggling with mental illness, you can reach out to. The first one being the Suicide Prevention Hotline. I'll close with, if you have a mental illness or you know someone who has a mental illness, it's okay to get help and to get them help. And you are not going through this alone. There are so many other people who deal with it every single day and they get through it. So you can too. Sorry to end on a little bit of a cliche, cheesy kind of note, but I hope you enjoyed my podcast.